be a screw, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 19th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. It started during lunch when Morag McDougal came over from the Ravenclaw table and stood behind Harry as he was getting ready to stand up. "Is it true you grew up in a castle?" she asked, her eyes curiously bright. She was taller than Harry. Naturally everyone was taller than Harry with brown eyes and elbow-length hair. Her face was oval-shaped, slightly taller than it was wide. "No," he replied, taken aback at the suddenness of the question. Scutula hip bumped him from his right. It was her turn to sit on his right. Sweetie was on his left, with Bloom beside her. "But you do now," she said with a smirk. She looked up at Morag. "Back home, that is," she clarified, in case anyone thought she meant Hogwarts. "I knew it," the witch said softly, her eyes gleaming as she made a fist and shook it in triumph. "I knew the books were true. That ad in the Daily Prophet was wrong." She chortled happily. Harry interrupted, alarmed at her conclusion. "No, the books are lies. I lived with Muggle relatives most of my life," he said. "Definitely not in a castle," he finished darkly. She tilted her head disbelievingly. "So, you don't live in a crystal castle with a princess?" "Well," he said reluctantly, "yes, I do. I live in Twilight's castle. And it is made of crystal." He paused a second. "But she only recently became a princess and she's only had the castle for a short while," he added quickly, seeing her triumphant expression. "We used to live in a library tree until Tyrek blew it up when he took everyone's magic." There was a silent crowd slowly gathering around them. Ginny was listening with narrowed eyes. Hermione, to the side of Scutulu, said, "I still can't believe you actually lived in a library in a tree." Harry looked at her. "Yeah, it was kinda ace, actually. Until Tyrek burned it down." He frowned. "The castle's sorta okay. Really big. I liked the library tree better." Hermione just stared at him, her mind obviously lost again in the fantasy of living in a library. He wondered if she was about to start drooling. Several of the Ravenclaws looked ready to join her if she did. "Aha," Morag said doubtfully, bringing his attention back to her. "And I suppose you don't ride a dragon, either?" He flushed a bit red at that. "Well, no, I don't have a dragon. Spike is my dragon friend." He smiled, almost more of a brother, truthfully. He cleared his throat. "But Spike's a baby dragon. He doesn't even have his wings yet." He felt his face get hotter as he turned a bit redder and tried to deflect the questions. "He's Princess Twilight's best assistant. She takes him everywhere, and he takes down all her notes for her." "So," the Ravenclaw said slowly, "you do have a dragon, and he's smart enough to read and write?" "Well yeah, but he's not mine. He's my friend." She eyed him carefully, a wide grin on her face now. "Of course you would say that," she said. He shifted uncomfortably. There was a rather large group of students listening in, now, not just the nearest Gryffindors. "Well, since your dragon friend is too small to ride, do you ride your griffin when you go on adventures?" Harry stared at her wide-eyed. "Ride a griffin? Are you barmy? Any griffin I tried to ride would have ripped my head off." He shook his head. "Besides, I'm sure the Griffin ambassador would throw a right proper wobbly if he heard that anyone in the royal family had been so disrespectful to his people." A few people in the background exchanged puzzled looks. Not deterred by his denial, Morag persisted, "And you don't go off and have adventures?" Harry looked away. First at the ceiling and then the students gathered around them. He could swear he saw at least one of the older students casting a spell of some kind, probably to listen in, considering how he wasn't very close. "Well," he said slowly, "not exactly. The adventures seem to come to us. Like the time a Cerberus wandered into town, a cockatrice turned Twilight to stone, or the diamond dogs captured Rarity." "Rarity's my older sister," Sweetie Belle interjected. "And the ever-free forest outside Ponyville has manticores, hydras, timber wolves, and all of which we've had run-ins with," Scootaloo added drily. "Timber wolves?" questioned someone in the crowd. Yeah," Harry said, "imagine a wolf as big as you, only made of wood and sticks. You can't kill it. But if you chop off a leg or drop something heavy on it. Like the tree branch beside the one you're clinging to," Scootaloo added helpfully. "They break apart and slowly reform. Takes them a couple of minutes. Gives you just enough time to run away, if you can." "Fire doesn't even kill them," Sweetie put in. "They just reform outside the fire." She shuddered. "And don't forget Stephen Magnet, the sea serpent," Scootaloo said to Harry. "Yeah," Sweetie said, "Stephen was nice." She glanced at her friends. "He knows some good jokes and he's almost as vain as my sister." They giggled as Harry rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure, she could say that, but Celestia forbid if anyone else said that about her sister. "Then there was the Tantibus," Bloom said. "It's a nightmare creature that threatened all of Ponyville," she explained, "and we all had to fight it." The Phillies and Harry all shivered at the memory. The students around them were staring at them, unsure whether they should believe them or not. On the one hand, Harry said all the books describing those fantastical adventures were lies. And then he confirmed new ones in the next breath. "What are you going on about now, Potter?" came the insulting voice of Draco. Malfoy had, for the most part, ignored Harry and the Phillies since the train trip. Apparently, he had been on the edge of the group around the table. Harry turned and looked at the Slytherin as his cronies, Crabbe and Goyle, pushed their way closer and made a path for him. "Malfoy," he said neutrally. The other wizard was flanked by his two followers, who looked as if they hadn't become any smarter since arriving at Hogwarts. "I'm sure those stories are all a bag of rubbish to make yourself look posh." Draco sneered. "You're just a peanuts ponce." Harry half smiled. "Malfoy, if I had told you back on the train that I was an animagus, and that my form was a unicorn, you would have called me barmy and a liar, just as you are now. And you would have been wrong, wouldn't you? Just as you are now, aren't you?" Surprised at Harry's effective rebuttal, Draco finally said, "Well, then, prove those stories are true." Harry just stared at him, then shrugged. "And how would I do that? You want me to summon a hydra, perhaps? Or bring over a timber wolf to let loose in the Forbidden Forest? Perhaps I should get a changeling or chimera to appear?" He shook his head. "No, I really don't care if you believe me. All I'm saying is that the stories in those books at the bookstores are all lies." "See," Draco said, smirking his eyes, "I knew it was all rubbish." The other students around rolled their eyes. They could see Harry had been trying to downplay his background. "But you do live in a crystal castle, with a real princess, have a dragon as a friend, and go on adventures, right?" Morag said. "You actually talked with a sea serpent? And you are a unicorn animagus?" Harry hung his head. "Yes. But most of our adventures end up with us in trouble with Twilight and their relatives," he pointed at the Phillies, "and covered in sap." "Sap?" came the astonished reply. Bloom and the other two scowled. "Yeah. We've been lucky so far. We've gone an entire month without once getting covered in sap," Sweetie said. "Playing Quidditch with the Weasleys had kept them out of both the Everfree beside Ponyville and the Weasley Orchard." Scootaloo punched her softly in the arm. "Hey. Don't go and jinx us. Bloom scowled some more. Well, at least it should be easier to remove here than it is at home. Giggling, the Ravenclaw girl left to find her friends. Harry sighed. He just knew she was going to be telling everyone the books were true despite him saying they weren't. Muttering and mumbling, the crowd started to disperse, then, as it was getting time for the next class. Castor had just put down his fork and leaned back in his chair. Dinner tonight had been wonderful. His appealing wife, Melada Searle. It was not quite 20 years ago that he had first met Melada Sarud, as she had been known then, smiled at him. He still wondered how he had managed to attract her attention, and then her love. Their just as appealing 15-year-old daughter, Talia Asker, picked up her plate and glass and took them to the sink. "I'll be at Jill's house, studying." "Okay, Mum," she said, turning to look. Her mother smiled genially. "Of course, dear. Just remember it's a school night and your curfew is 9 o'clock. Smiling just as broadly, the girl skipped over and kissed both her father and mother on the cheek, and happily left the dining room. "Cup of tea?" she asked, standing and collecting their plates. "Sure." They heard the front door slam as she put their cups on the table. "Honey," she said as she sat down across from him. She took a sip, and then said the 4 words guaranteed to bring terror into the heart any man: "We need to talk." Castor's blood ran cold and the marvelous warm dinner in his stomach seemed to turn to cold lead. "Oh, dear," he said calmly. "Ever since you took your new job at Scotland Yard, you've been quite preoccupied." She studied him, smiling. "I don't mind the hours. I understand you're settling in and need extra effort to acclimate and get up to speed on your cases." Only his many hours under fire kept him from breaking out in a sweat, and held his hand steady as a rock as he took a sip of his own tea. "However, even when you're home, you're not really home. You're staring off into the distance and obviously troubled. And you've been tossing and turning in bed, and you've started talking in your sleep again." She looked at him levelly, no longer smiling. "You haven't done that since sport and social." She was staring him right in the eyes. "And you've never done it with your other cases in the department, no matter how much they upset you. What's going on?" He took another sip and considered his options. He was never any good at telling Millie lies. Somehow, she always knew when he played fast and loose with the truth. She even knew when he wasn't telling her the complete truth. He sighed. He knew he should keep it quiet, but she was also quite good at keeping secrets. He nodded, more to himself than her. "I've been recruited by MI5. Aliens, as in not from Earth aliens, have contacted the government and I've been appointed as their contact man. I've been helping them get used to Earth. They normally look like a waist-tall unicorn, Pegasi, or pony, but they can change to look like a person with very long hair." She gave him a sour look and sighed. "If you can't tell me because you're on a sensitive case, at least you could say so," she said reproachfully. "There's no reason to make up a tosh story." His mouth dropped open. "But aliens? Unicorns?" She shook her head. "If you're gonna tell me a lie, at least you could make it somewhat believable." She reached across and grabbed his hand. "I'm not going to throw a wobbly just because you're on a sensitive case, dear. You know that." He looked down for a moment. "All right. You're right. It's a really sensitive case and I can't talk about it, but it's really involved." He looked up at her. "You'll read about it in the papers in about a year, maybe less." She leaned back in her chair. "There, now, that wasn't so hard, was it?" She got up and came around the table and hugged him. "You know I love you. And you can tell me anything you want that isn't secret, and I'll still keep it a secret." Then she grinned. "And Thowley is gone for the next 3 hours." She pulled on his hand and led him from the kitchen up the stairs to their bedroom. The Gryffindor's table in the library had become quite crowded, as now not only did all the Gryffindor first years study together, but all of the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff first ties were there as well. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how Harry looked at it, he didn't have to spend as much time helping students with the book manifestation spell and could work on his own assignments. That meant that he couldn't escape transforming in the Gryffindor common room with the others. After hearing that the Frnds had already completed their assignments, the Gryffindor upper year witches, naturally, demanded that the first-year animagi become ponies. The witches just could not get enough of the ponies that stood knee-high or lower. Cuddling, petting, and combing the adorable and fluffy ponies was apparently quite addictive for them. While the wizards denied the attraction, Harry couldn't help but notice that a fair number of them spent at least a few minutes petting the ponies. Some of the wizards did admit that the ponies were the cutest things they had ever seen. And watching Scootaloo and Ginny preen their feathers had made one wizard loudly proclaim that the ponies were going to give him diabetes. Which he followed up with by challenging one of the other boys to an arm wrestling competition. That became a surprisingly popular pastime for the boys in the days that followed. Chess became another favorite. One game that took the wizards by storm with its cutthroat competition was London Monopoly. Which, over the winter, became Wizarding Monopoly by the alteration of many chance and community chest cards and changing the properties to wizarding locations. Harry thought it rather interesting that neither the twins, nor Oliver, Angelina, and Alicia from the Quidditch team, made an appearance in the common room that evening while all this was going on. The twins, he was sure, did it because having a secret unicorn pony form would undoubtedly aid them in their pranking. The Quidditch team. Well, he couldn't figure that out. Astronomy class that night had been difficult. With a normal bedtime of 9 o'clock for the first years, staying up an extra 3 hours for the midnight class was challenging. What was worse, though, was then trying to stay awake during the hour-long class itself. At the top of the astronomy tower. In the dark. With only their wands providing light when they took notes. Next time, Harry decided, he would try to sleep from 7 until 11:30. Maybe that would help. Afterwards, Harry and the fillies had waited for each other until all of them had packed their telescopes away before leaving. The other Gryffindors had straggled down the stairs as quickly as they could manage, listening only to their bed siren call. Thus, it was that the fillies, Harry, and, for some reason, Neville and Hermione, were the last to leave the astronomy tower, the entrance of which was on the 2nd floor. Not the 7th, which would have been convenient for the half-asleep students. They had barely started up the central staircase that the other Gryffindors had used to get back to the 7th floor when it suddenly began to move. When it stopped, it led to the 4th floor, not the 7th. On the opposite side of the central stairwell, on the 4th floor, was a staircase that led to the 7th floor. Sighing, the 6 continued up to the 4th floor. After they left that staircase and rounded the corner of the central stairwell towards the one they wanted, Harry saw that staircase suddenly abandon them. They stopped and dully watched as their way to the 7th floor dropped from their floor to the floor below them, the 3rd floor. "Pony feathers," said Scootaloo. Then she yawned widely, triggering yawns in the all. "Look," Harry said and pointed. "That staircase goes to the 3rd floor." It was around the next corner of the central stairwell. And, miraculously, it stayed put long enough for them to reach it and make it to the 3rd floor. Then they watched both staircases, the one they had just ascended and the one that led up to the 7th floor, abruptly swing away. Which left them stranded on the 3rd floor. Hermione sighed tiredly. "I think there's a staircase down that hall," she pointed. "That will take us up to the 7th floor. Isn't that staircase at the end of the castle?" Sweetie Belle said dejectedly. "Yeah," Hermione agreed, "but it's better than chasing these bloody staircases here all night." The others were too tired to even remark on her cussing. They just started to trudge, half asleep, in that direction. It was the sudden hiss that caught them by surprise when they were only halfway down that hall. It was Mrs. Norris, they saw, a moment later. The cat stared at them malevolently for a second, then spun and dashed off in a blur of fur. "Ah, CRP, Harry said. "Filch'll never believe we're on our way back to the dorm." He turned and started hurrying back to way they had come. "Maybe there's a staircase there now that will get us off this floor before Filch catches us." They reached the stairwell to see that there still were no staircases leading away. Behind them they heard Filch's wheezing voice, "They can't have gone far, my love, hurry, sniff them out." The Gryffindors ran to the opposite side of the stairwell and started down that hall only to run into a door partway down it. They looked around and saw no other way out except back to where Filch was surely waiting for them. "It's locked," whispered Neville, jiggling the door handle. Hermione sighed tiredly. "Are you a wizard or not? Budge over." She pushed him out of the way, tapped the lock with her wand, and whispered, "Alohomora." There was a click and the door swung open. They quickly pushed through it. Just before they closed it, however, Harry quickly cast Scourgify on the floor and down the corridor. Hermione cast a Colloportus, relocking the door. They pressed their ears against the door, listening. "They ran down this corridor, I heard them, my sweet," they heard Filch say. "Marrow," came the response. He said, "there aren't any secret passages down there." They heard his footsteps coming closer. "Are you sure you don't smell them?" Another "Marrow" was his answer. Neville tugged on Harry's sleeve. Harry whispered, "Get off, Neville," and shook his arm. They all jumped and stared at the doorknob as the castle caretaker jiggled it. Still locked. He stomped away. "And you don't smell them, my sweet?" "Don't see why not, they all smell to high heaven, anyway," he growled. "You'd think they never heard of showers and bathing," he added bitterly. His voice faded in the distance. "I could swear they went down this corridor." "Humph. Next time I'll get them," they heard him say angrily. Neville tugged HRD on Harry's sleeve. "Harry," he said, his voice low and quavering in fright. "What?" Harry said, irritated, as he turned around. For a moment, he was sure he was back in the Ponyville. In front of them was a monstrous dog that filled the whole space between ceiling and floor. It had 3 giant heads. There were 3 pairs of rolling, mad eyes, 3 noses, twitching and quivering, 3 mouths, saliva hanging in slippery ropes from yellowish fangs. "Woofy!" Scootaloo exclaimed, astonished. "What's Woofy doing here?" Sweetie Belle looked at Harry. "Do you think Twilight knows he's not guarding Tartarus?" Hermione and Neville stared at the 3 girls, eyes wide in disbelief at their casual attitude. "Girls," Harry said, "I don't think that's Woofy. And Fluttershy isn't here. And this guy seems mighty upset." It was quite still, all 6 eyes staring at them, blinking. Harry knew from their experiences in the Everfree that the only reason they weren't already eaten was that their sudden appearance had taken it by surprise. It wouldn't take long to recover though, as its thunderous growl started to shake the floor. He heard the 3 gulp as they realized that the door hadn't led to an empty classroom. That they were in a corridor. The forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor, to be precise. And now they knew why the headmaster had said to stay away unless you wanted to die. Meanwhile, Hermione and Neville had not been idle. If it came down to being caught by Filch and getting an unpleasant detention, or death, they'd take the detention. The door was unlocked and opened far faster than they had done it originally. They didn't run out the open door as much as they fell backward through it. Harry, the last one out, slammed the door shut, and they ran. Changing to ponies took less than a thought, and Harry held Neville in his magic as they pelted down the corridor at full gallop. Filch must have hurried off to look for them somewhere else, because they didn't see him anywhere, but they didn't care. All they wanted to do was put as much space as possible between them and that monster. Astonishingly, when they reached the central stairwell there was a staircase that led directly from this floor to the 7th right in front of them. They charged up the staircase at full speed. They didn't stop galloping until they reached their dorm. Once safely inside their dorm, they collapsed, trembling and gasping for air, sweat covering them head to toe, except Neville, onto the couches and armchairs nearest to them. "What the bloody hell was that?" Neville gasped. "What do they think they're doing, keeping a thing like that in a school?" "Language, Neville." Hermione was still working at getting her breath back. You don't use your eyes, do you? She said, staring at him with narrowed eyes. Didn't you see what it was standing on? She turned to the equestrians. And you four, Woofy. Seriously? Ah, Harry said, breathing heavily still. He looked at his friends. Well, we did tell you we met a Cerberus back home, in Ponyville, didn't we now? He sighed, it kept chewing on house roofs until Fluttershy distracted it long enough for Twilight to use a giant squeaky ball to trick it into returning to Tartarus. Fluttershy? Hermione said incredulously, the witch who hides if you look at her. She confronted a Cerberus. Are we talking about the same person? Harry sighed. Well, she's really good with animals. She started giving Woofy belly rubs and tickles. Hermione and Neville stared at him in disbelief. He shrugged. I can't explain it any better. He snorted in wry amusement. We did get a poster the next day from Princess Celestia asking everyone to keep a lookout for her lost dog, though. He shook his head ruefully. Under distinguishing features, she put, very cute, has 3 heads, is as large as a house, answers to Woofy. Cute. Hermione and Neville echoed in patent disbelief. Cute. They looked as if they were afraid to ask if he was joking. And no, I wasn't looking at its feet, Neville said. She gave her head a shake, then said. It was standing on a trapdoor. It's obviously guarding something. Well, duh, said Scootaloo. Isn't that what a Cerberus does? Guard things? She looked at Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom. Wonder what she's guarding, she said speculatively, her lips stretching into a small smile. I think we have some exploring to do. Hermione stared at them, flabbergasted, then threw her hands into the air in frustration. What is wrong with you? We could have been killed or worse, expelled, she said indignantly. She got up and stomped off to her dorm room. Harry facepalmed with his hooves. Between the spiders in the forest and the treasure the Cerberus had to be guarding, keeping out of trouble would be impossible this year. Well, at least with the Cerberus in the corridor, Tree Sap would not be involved. He hoped. Thursday had a bumpy start. First, there was the fact that by the time they had returned from astronomy class it had been almost 2 o'clock in the morning, meaning few of the Gryffindor first years had gotten more than 5 hours of sleep. There was a lot of yawning at that end of the breakfast table. When they walked into their herbology class, Ron and Apple Bloom were ambushed by the walking plants. Ah, they both screamed as they were hit with dozens of the plants dropping on them from over the door. Get em off. Get em off, they both yelled, swiping at their heads and running around in the greenhouse. It took the concerted efforts of Professor Sprout and the rest of the class to succeed in corralling the mischievous plants. Well, I never, exclaimed the professor when they were done, wiping her forehead with a hand and smearing dirt across it. She put her hands on her hips as she glared at the errant plants. Am I going to have to cage you all? The plants did not seem ashamed at all. If anything, they seemed to exude an air of disappointment. Apple Bloom stalked over to the rack in which the plants were currently cornered. She glared at them. I got a wand, now, and I'm not afraid to use it, she said, holding up her wand threateningly. And I know incendio. A little flame shot from the wand tip. The plants shuffled away from her. Sweetie Belle said, I wonder what they want. The class looked at her. She shrugged, well, I mean, they didn't actually do anything, now did they? Professor Sprout looked back and forth between the plants and their targets. She smiled. Special project, class. They groaned and looked at her suspiciously. Each of you take one of the plants with you today. After every class cast a diagnostic spell on the plant and each other, and copy the results to paper. Bring the walking plants back to me after your last class of the day. As an overnight assignment, compare the results and see if there are any differences. Tomorrow, come by before breakfast and hand in your assignment. Then pick up the same plant you had today. We'll do this for several days to see if we can figure out why the walking plants favor Mr. Weasley and Miss Bloom. She motioned them to spread out a bit. First, here's the spell for the plants. It took almost 20 minutes before everyone had it down perfectly. And here's the medical diagnostic I want you to cast on each other. It can't be used on yourself, someone else has to cast it on you. That spell took almost the rest of their class. And, finally, to make sure you don't copy down anything incorrectly, use this spell to copy the other 2 spell results to paper. That was a simple spell and took only a few minutes to learn. Then they each went to the walking plant tray and selected one. Ron and Apple Bloom held back, which was probably prudent. Otherwise, there might have been a plant riot as the tiny bushes vied with one another to go with Ron or Apple Bloom. Harry watched Apple Bloom's selection as it preened itself after it had climbed her arm to her shoulder and partially hid itself in her hair. Ron's hair being too short to act as sufficient camouflage, his choice just clung to shoulder and somehow conveyed an air of smugness. Like the plants the girls had, Harry's snuggled up to his long hair in an attempt to hide. The plants the boys chose rode on their shoulders. None opted for hiding in a pocket. The Gryffindor and Hufflepuff boys did look a bit unusual with what appeared to be small hedges stuck to their shoulders, which drew a bit of attention from the other students in the halls. The girls, with their plants hiding against their hair, were not nearly as conspicuous, but they too, drew curious looks. For once, Harry and the fillies were not being singled out as the preferred recipients of stares. "What's this?" Professor Flitwick said as the first years arrived in Charms class. He insisted that they demonstrate their newly learned spells, and spent the rest of the class explaining how those spells worked and what their limits were. He also gave them an assignment on the spell's origins and derivations, as well. The Ravenclaws were, well, green with envy over the rather advanced charms their herbology professor had taught the other 2 houses. They were studying furiously to catch up. Harry found it disconcerting to have the little plant hanging out on his shoulder. He kept forgetting about it and then seeing it out of the corner of his left eye, it was on his left shoulder, that being closer to Sweetie Belle and Ron in this class, and jerking his head to look in that direction. He wasn't the only one to do that, he saw with some relief. After class was their first try at getting the reports done and copied to paper before they were late to their next class. Fortunately, it being lunch, being late wasn't a concern. But it would be for the other 2 classes that day. They quickly paired up so they would be ready. After lunch, Professor McGonagall merely gave the Gryffindors an arched eyebrow as they came in. Harry figured Professor Sprout must have told the other professors at lunch what the Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs were doing with the plants. She continued the lesson from the day before, answering questions, giving an additional lecture, and making their match-cum-needle longer and fancier. DADA was boring. Professor Quirrell's stutter seemed worse today than usual and the day's notes barely took up 2 centimeters on their paper. He seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time staring at Harry, Sweetie Belle, and Hermione, though. The Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs piled out Greenhouse No. 1's door after dropping off their walking plants. Ginny and Scootaloo transformed almost immediately and zoomed up into the sky. The rest meandered slowly across the lawn. Harry sighed, watching the 5 Pegasi swooping around each other. It was fun, wasn't it, Sweetie, Bloom? Flying, that is. They looked up at the Pegasi and sighed, yeah, it was. Apple Bloom said as Sweetie Belle nodded. Then Sweetie Belle frowned. 5, she said. Am I seeing things? Or are there really 5 up there? Harry squinted, yep, I see 5. He grinned. I guess Oliver and the girls have decided to come out and play, he half-whispered to the 2 fillies. A faint cry of Quidditch reached them and the Pegasi suddenly swooped off towards the Quidditch pitch. Harry laughed. Loudly, he said, who do you think would win? A Quidditch Pegasi team or a wizarding team? 2 of the Hufflepuffs still standing nearby suddenly jerked around to look at him, turned to look towards the Quidditch pitch, and then ran into the castle. Harry snickered. No doubt they were heading to inform the Hufflepuff team of the challenge, before the Ravenclaws heard of it and could get there first. Race ya to the lake, challenged Apple Bloom just after transforming. Sweetie Belle and Harry looked at her, shrugged, and transformed. So did Ron and Hermione, and the small string of ponies thundered across the lawn in a five-way race. Surprisingly, or maybe not, Harry decided, Apple Bloom and Ron were leading and neck the whole way. Then it was a race to Hagrid's hut. Again, the two earth ponies stayed out in front. Harry decided that after spending all day in the castle, kicking his heels up and racing around the lawn was just what he needed. It felt good to stretch his legs. They reached Hagrid's hut and slowed to a walk, panting. That was fun, declared Apple Bloom. Just what I needed after being stuck sittin' all day. Before the others could agree, though, the hut door opened and Hagrid came out. "What's this?" he said in surprise, seeing the tiny ponies outside his porch. While they were small compared to most people, their heads barely reaching to mid-thigh to the 6th and 7th year students, Hagrid dwarfed them. His boots were bigger than the ponies. "Unicorn foals," he said, bending down for a closer look. Harry hurriedly changed back. The others quickly changed forms, too. "Hi, Hagrid," he said loudly, and waving to keep the big wizard's attention off the fillies. He knew the half-giant couldn't remember him from the brief time he had shepherded the first ties across the lake. "I'm Harry Potter." Hagrid put his hands on his hips and laughed. "Hiya, Harry. I'd heard the Gryffindor first years were animagi ponies." He jovially eyed them. "So, you're unicorns, eh?" "Yep," answered Harry and changed back to a unicorn. "Hermione and Sweetie Belle are unicorns while Ron and Apple Bloom are earth ponies." He ran a quick circle around the half-giant. "Scootaloo and Ginny are Pegasi. They're over playing Quidditch right now." He stopped and pointed off towards the Quidditch pitch. "Let me take a look at ya," Hagrid said, lowering his hand. "Okay," said Harry. He stopped to let the wizard grab him around his barrel and lift him up to eye level. Hagrid said, turning Harry left and right. "You're a bit different than the forest unicorns," he said. "Besides being smaller, that is. A bit thicker in the legs, and your eyes are much, much larger. Fasten more forward, too." He mused. "The muzzle is also shorter." He paused. "I reckon the shape of your muzzle lets ya talk, too." "Oh, yes," Harry said. "It feels like I'm talking normally. And my teeth and bite are arranged similar to people, except the canines are small and way back." He opened his mouth wide and pulled his lips back. Hagrid inspected him closely. "You're right, I can see that. And I can even cast magic," Harry added, shooting sparks from his horn. "Now, that isn't something the forest unicorns canna do," exclaimed Hagrid, looking impressed. "While they can do magic, they have to touch ya with their horn to do anything. He set Harry carefully back down. "So's," he said, "I guess you're done with your classes fair the day." Harry affirmed. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "I just put a pot on." They looked at each other. After all their running, Harry was a bit thirsty. Plus, the half-giant was the groundskeeper for the school, so he wasn't a danger to any of them, and he did seem nice. Harry tilted his head towards the hut and arched his eyebrows while looking at his classmates. The others either shrugged or nodded. "Sure, Hagrid. Sounds good." The rough wizard smiled broadly and opened the door. "Be careful, Fawn. He's harmless, but a bit enthusiastic." Fawn, they discovered, was a dog almost big enough for them to saddle and ride as people. Harry hurriedly changed back to human form as they went in. "Make yourselves a home," said Hagrid, bustling over to his fireplace. Fawn spent a few moments inspecting and licking each of them before Hagrid finally hauled him back and made him go to his bed. "I only got 4 cups, so you'll have to share," Hagrid explained, setting the aforementioned cups on a table that was almost as tall as they were, but with only 2 chairs. Hagrid did not get many visitors, it appeared. The cups were big bowls with handles on them. As far as the kids were concerned, the cups were almost as big as the pots they used to make tea at home. In fact, the only way they could drink a full cup would be if they shared. Harry and Sweetie Belle shared one chair, and a bowl of tea, while the other three sat on the bed. Ron got a bowl to himself, and seemed determined to finish it off. Harry introduced the others as Hagrid placed rock cakes on the table and handed a second plate to Apple Bloom, who was sitting between Hermione and Ron. "Another Weasley, eh?" said Hagrid, glancing at Ron's hair. "I spend half me life chasin' your twin brothers away from the forest." The rock cakes were shapeless lumps with raisins that only Apple Bloom and Ron seemed to be able to chew. Harry wouldn't be surprised to discover that the rock in the name rock cakes was literal. They took turns describing their lessons, so far. "Professor Bin didn't know he were dead, eh?" Hagrid said. "Figures. Well, can't say I'm sad to hear you'll be getting a new professor. Can't be worse at it, that's fair sure. He always did put me to sleep." Hagrid looked over at Ron. "How's your brother Charlie?" He nodded approvingly. "I liked him a lot. Great with animals, he was." While Ron explained Charlie's work at the Romanian Dragon Reserve, Harry picked up a piece of parchment was lying on the table under the tea cozy. It was from the Daily Prophet. It told of a break-in at Gringotts that happened the same day Harry and the equestrians were there. Nothing had been stolen as the vault had been emptied just that morning. Harry showed the clipping to Sweetie Belle. She looked back at him, just as surprised. Someone had dared. They shook their heads ruefully. Harry looked up at the half-giant curiously. He had been in the bank that morning, too. Were the two somehow connected? Hagrid saw what he was reading and nervously laughed. He handed Harry another rock cake and took the clipping back. "Amazin' what some wizards'll do, ain't it?" he mumbled, crumpling the paper in his hand and stuffing it in a pocket. At Hagrid's request, they all transformed and stood on his table while he studied them. "Ain't never seen colors like that on any horses or ponies," he stated, shaking his head. "And your earth ponies, yes eh?" He pointed at Ron and Apple Bloom. They nodded, as Apple Bloom explained, "Earth ponies are skilled at making plants grow. Plus, we're stronger and faster than the unicorns or Pegasi." That required a demonstration, so they all trooped outside. Apple Bloom selected one pumpkin plant and made it quickly ripen. Harry, using his horn, showed off a few of the spells they had learned. Castor's day had started early. "Your Highness, I would like to introduce the United Kingdom's Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Robert Macready May, Baron May of Oxford. And this is Doctor of Physics, Michael B. Green, one of our leading experts on string theory. Gentlemen, this is Princess Twilight Sparkle." And that had begun a marathon round of science and math discussions that had thrilled Twilight, reduced both men to near tears, and had left Castor completely in the dark. Both men went back and forth through the portal no less than a dozen times. The world on the other side wasn't nearly as interesting as the portal, itself, to them. That Twilight and Castor transformed as they went through the portal, and not the other two, had left them completely gobsmacked. After the first hour back at the house, and filling an expanded wall-sized chalkboard, Twilight had said, "If we combine your Type 1, Types IIA and IIB, and heterotic theories with our alternates I, 3, and V magic theories, I think an 11-dimensional comprehensive theory can be made to work." She had already told them the equestrian's theories required at least 8 dimensions, and, she had added, "We've managed to determine that those 2 of the dimensions are directly related to magic." Several hours later, after filling several more giant chalkboards and with a considerable amount of arguing, they had decided the new M theory was the answer. The was M for either magic or mystery, depending on if the speaker knew about the equestrians. The scientists were very envious of Twilight's ability to hover 3 meters off the ground while taking a closer look at a previous chalkboard equation, its derivation, and final conclusion. Being floated with her was certainly a novel experience. How it was possible for a macro being to affect dimensions postulated to be smaller than a fraction of an atom in size was something to be discussed at another time. Somewhere in that time they had lunch and dinner, but only Castor could have told anyone what they had eaten. Their new briefcases, he knew, were going to be guarded treasures for the rest of their lives once they finished working out the mathematics that let them work, much less exist, without crashing all of creation. You should have seen the Hufflepuffs floundering, bragged Ginny at the dinner table, later that evening. We beat them the way a beater beats a bludger, hard and without mercy. She and Scootaloo giggled. They never had a chance. We're just too quick and fast for them. Scootaloo accidentally showed them how tough a Pegasus is when she tried to make a tight turn chasing the snitch. We were taking turns. She went a shade wider than she intended and rammed a goal post head-on. Scootaloo blushed. She hung there a moment, then slid down the post. We all stopped and stared as she hit the ground. Ginny took a drink of her juice. I was just heading for her when Scootaloo staggered upright at the bottom of the goal post, shook her head a few times, and then launched herself back into the game. Her flying was a bit erratic, at first, but quickly smoothed out as the game continued. Scootaloo grinned. Pegasi are tough. One of the Ravenclaws near Harry asked, shouldn't someone have gone for MDM Pomfrey? Nah, Apple Bloom said, Pegasi have heads like rocks. Almost as smart, too. Scootaloo stuck her tongue out at Bloom, then sighed. She glanced down at her hip and regretfully said, no cutie mark, though. The other two equestrians also sighed. Cutie mark? Queried a Ravenclaw as the other Gryffindors looked up, too, interested in the answer. Cutie marks define your special magical talent, explained Sweetie Belle. We've been trying everything we could think of for the last 2 years to see if that was our special talent, but with no luck. What? The Ravenclaw said, voicing the puzzlement that everyone else was showing. Harry sighed and interrupted. Where these three come from, he waved his hand at the 3 fillies. When you find the one thing that you are especially talented at, the one thing that you enjoy doing the most with your magic, then magic gifts you with a symbol on your hips that shows everyone what you're especially good at. His audience nodded, but was still clearly uncertain of what he meant. Harry thought for a moment. For example, Apple Bloom's sister runs the family farm. She loves nothing better than caring for her trees, harvesting apples, and seeing people enjoy the literal fruits of her labor. She got her cutie mark when she realized that that was what made her happy, when she realized she had to be true to herself. Her cutie mark is 3 apples. Everyone stared at Apple Bloom, then back at Harry. Sweetie Belle's sister got her cutie mark when she was making costumes for a school play. Everyone liked the costumes, but she felt something just wasn't right. She liked making clothes, and even thought she might like to do more of that. Several of the listening girls nodded. They could understand that. Then, just when she was beginning to doubt herself the most, to think that maybe she should give up on making costumes and clothes, she went outside, the night before the performance, and followed a pull on her magic. She discovered a bunch of gems, and realized what was missing from her costumes. She decorated the costumes with gems, and when she saw how everyone loved her creations during the play, she knew that she wanted nothing more than to be the best fashion designer in the country. And her cutie mark appeared, 3 gems. He smiled, she made our school robes. They all looked at the robes Harry and the fillies were wearing. Lavender Brown spoke up. By the way, those aren't real gems, are they? She asked, pointing at the thumb-sized buttons on their robes. Harry looked down at his as Sweetie Belle said proudly, oh, yes, they are. Rarity would never use anything but the best materials for her creations. She pointed at the yellow, almost gold-colored gem at the top of her robes. This is a yellow oval sapphire. Then she pointed at the red one below it. And this one is an oval ruby. The other students stared at them. The 2 sets of gems alternated down the length of their robes. Blimey! Ron said breathlessly. Yeah, whispered Lavender beside him. Dean looked up and down the robes. Just one of those gems is more than my dad makes in a year, and there must be a dozen on each of your robes. The fillies looked around, surprised. Really? Said Scootaloo. I didn't think they were worth all that much. She shrugged. Rarity's got a bucket of them in all kinds of colors in her workroom, Sweetie Belle said. Most are much smaller than these, though. Bucket, said Sean dazedly as everyone nodded dazedly. Ha, Scuttaloo said. She looked over at Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle. Guess that must be why the goblins gave us so much for that bag of gems we gave them. The other two shrugged. The listening Gryffindors goggled at the idea of anyone talking so casually about a bag of such gems. She grinned widely, pretty good for what we thought would only be enough for snacks through the year. The other two giggled. Their audience exchanged amazed looks. And magic does this cutie mark stuff, said Lily, bringing them back to the original subject. Ah-ha, confirmed Apple Bloom. I wonder why we've never heard of anything like that, mused Neville. I'm sure Gran or Uncle Alfie would have mentioned it if they had ever heard of such a thing. The rest of dinner passed in relative quiet as the other Gryffindors mulled over what they had learned about the foreign students. Harry noticed that Professor McGonagall was still peeved the headmaster. He was almost positive he saw her hex him, but that couldn't be right. Professors would never do something like that, would they? They spent the evening in the library doing their class assignments, to the dismay of all the witches waiting in Gryffindor for the cuddlesome ponies. Double potions with the Slytherins, said Ron looking at the schedule during breakfast the next day, Friday. Professor Snape's head of Slytherin house. My brothers all say he always favors them. I guess we'll see if it's true. Harry sighed. I wish McGonagall favored us, said Harry. She was head of Gryffindor house. That hadn't stopped her from giving them a huge pile of assignments the day before. The potions classroom was down in one of the dungeons. It was colder there than up in the main castle. The room was made creepier with the pickled animals floating in glass jars all around the walls. The ponies were appalled. The jars' contents grossed out and upset the fillies, making them turn a little green. Harry and the fillies seated themselves and pulled out their quills and paper. Like the other professors, Snape started the class by taking the roll call. However, just as Flitwick did, he paused at Harry's name. Ah, yes, he said quietly, Harry Potter. Our new celebrity. Harry and the fillies exchanged puzzled looks. What had Harry done to deserve that kind of reaction? Harry had the feeling that Professor Snape was going to be inordinately strict. Draco Malfoy and his friends Crabbe and Goyle sniggered behind their hands. Snape finished calling the names and looked up at the class. His eyes were black like Hagrid's, but they held none of Hagrid's warmth. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making, he said. He was barely louder than a whisper, but they hung every word. Like Professor McGonagall, Snape had a gift for effortlessly keeping a class silent. With so little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, and snaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. More silence followed this little speech. The only sound Harry could hear was the faint scritching of his and Sweetie Belle's quill taking notes. Harry, Ron, and the fillies exchanged looks with raised eyebrows. Hermione was on the edge of her seat and looked desperate to start proving that she wasn't a dunderhead. Snape stared at Harry, or was he staring at Harry's quill taking notes? Sneering. Potter, said Snape suddenly. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Hermione's hand shot up into the air. Harry was glad he had taken the time last night for one more walk through his copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. He thought, remembering. Fortunately, the text usually mentioned the most common uses for each of the items listed. Sir, he said respectfully, asphodel and wormwood, along with sloth brain and saprophoros bean juice, make a sleeping potion known as the Draught of Living Death. The professor looked disgruntled at his answer. He pursed his lips, then said, Potter, if I told you to find me a bezoar, where would you look? Hermione was gripping her desktop with one hand and urgently waving her other. Harry considered his answer. I would get it out of my kit, sir, as it is one of the regular items in a first year's potions kit. The professor frowned and his eyes narrowed, clearly displeased. And if it weren't there? Then, sir, I would check the hospital stores here at Hogwarts as it is a common cure for most poisons. If that failed, I would see if there were any goats around because a bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, sir. The professor looked furious. Harry couldn't understand what was upsetting the wizard. Wasn't he answering the questions properly? Wasn't he being respectful? Or was he going to be like Uncle Vernon? Quick to criticize and take offense at anything you said. What is the difference, Potter, between monkshood and wolfsbane? At this, Hermione stood up, her arm outstretched toward the ceiling. Harry smiled, he could almost see the text from his book floating in front of his eyes. They are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite, sir. Snape was not pleased with Harry's answer, almost grinding his teeth together. Sit down, he snapped at Hermione. Well? Why aren't you all copying that down? He said to the rest of the class, now glaring at Harry's quill. Everyone started rummaging for quills and parchment. Over the noise, Snape said, and a point will be taken from Gryffindor House for your cheek, Potter. Things didn't improve for the Gryffindors. Snape put them all into pairs and set them to making a simple boil's cure potion. Unfortunately, he paired Neville with Sweetie Belle, both of whom were sitting beside Harry and Bloom. Harry hoped Neville might be able to prevent a catastrophe. Apple Bloom shot to her feet, hand raised high. Professor Snape. I think Sweetie Belle should have me as a partner and Neville, Harry. As one, the entire class turned and stared at the obviously insane Gryffindor, then turned and stared at their professor. Professor Snape glared at her, one eyebrow raised in disdain. Oh, he sneered. The class turned to Apple Bloom. Apple Bloom, from years of being glared at by her sister in the aftermath of a cutie mark crusade, shrugged it off and continued. Yes, sir. The last time we let Sweetie Belle fix something she set the kitchen on fire. She lowered her hand. The class turned to their professor. The bat-like wizard stiffened at the perceived insult. The art of potion making is nothing like mere cooking, he sneered angrily. Cease your pathetic attempt at hiding your abysmal abilities by shifting attention to another. Start your assignment. The class turned to Apple Bloom. But sir, Apple Bloom persisted, she was getting us ice cream from the ice box. The class turned to stare at Sweetie Belle, who was standing with her hands on her hips staring angrily, in turn, at Apple Bloom. Professor. Snape narrowed his eyes and, after a quick glance at the red-faced and glaring Sweetie Belle, said, nonetheless, unless you wish a detention this weekend, be quiet and get to work. After barely a moment's pause, he added, and a point off for questioning my judgment. Apple Bloom sighed. Yes, sir. She muttered to Harry, well, I tried. The Slytherins closest to Sweetie Belle took a long look at the red-faced girl and began moving their books and equipment to other desks, ones at the edge of the classroom. The Gryffindors on her other side watched the Slytherins, wide-eyed, and decided to follow their example. Soon, Sweetie Belle and Neville were surrounded by a ring of empty desks except for Harry and Apple Bloom. While Sweetie and Bloom were at the cabinet getting the supplies not included in their potions kits, Harry urgently whispered, Neville. Neville turned to look at him. Keep a sharp eye on Sweetie Belle, she's horrible at following cooking instructions. Her sister banned her from setting foot in the kitchen. She's not even allowed to go in to get a glass of water. Neville gave him an uncertain nod and watched Sweetie Belle return with nervous apprehension. Professor Snape swooped around the classroom in his bat-like long black cloak. He watched them weigh dried nettles and crush snake fangs. He criticized almost everyone except Malfoy, whom he seemed to like. He was just telling everyone to look at Malfoy's perfectly stewed horned slugs when there was a loud sneeze, a yelp. Clouds of bright lavender smoke filled the dungeon. Neville and Sweetie Belle had managed to mess up their potion. Harry couldn't see anything through the smoke except the bottoms of their tables and stools. The class abandoned their cauldrons and began to spill out into the corridor, coughing little lavender puffs as they tried to clear their lungs. "Idiots," snarled Snape in a high pitch, clearing the smoke with a wave of his wand. "What did you do?" He had a bubble of clear air around his head. Sweetie Belle and Neville quailed under his menacing stare. The Slytherins, those that weren't still coughing a bit, snickered. Then gasped as they stared at their head of house with wide, disbelieving eyes. Sweetie Belle took a breath, coughed, then tried again. "It was almost time to add the porcupine quills when I saw a hair just inside the cauldron, so I grabbed a porcupine quill and used it to hook the hair." She coughed lightly. "But the potion's smell made me sneeze and I dropped the quill and hair into the cauldron. Then that lavender smoke started to pour up." One of the Slytherin girls suddenly yelled, "I'm a boy." A second later one of the boys screeched and yelled, "Merlin, I'm a girl." He was grabbing himself through his robes. Snape's eyes suddenly widened as he looked down. Then he turned and glowered at the two Gryffindors. If looks could kill, both Neville and Sweetie Belle would have exploded into flames. Chaos reigned for several seconds as the Gryffindors and remaining Slytherins confirmed that the lavender smoke had, indeed, reversed their genders as well. To the hospital wing, Snape spat at them in a surprising soprano tone. Then she rounded on Harry and Apple Bloom, who had been working next to Neville. "You Potter, why didn't you tell her to use one of her stirring rods? Thought she'd make you look good if she got it wrong, did you? That's another point you've lost for Gryffindor," he said nastily. Harry stared at the man in disbelief. He opened his mouth to argue, but Ron grabbed his arm. "Don't push it," he muttered, "I've heard Snape can be nasty. Consider what Sweetie and Neville just did." They both shuddered. As they headed for the hospital wing, Harry's mind was racing and his spirits were low. Why did Snape so dislike him? What could he have done? And he was now a girl. How could things get worse? Ron muttered, "I sure hope the hospital matron can fix this." Harry felt like kicking Ron for jinxing them. Naturally, she couldn't. "You'll have to wait until it wears off," MDM Pomfrey had said. "If it doesn't wear off in a week, we'll call St. Mungo's." Even changing to ponies and back, didn't cure Harry and the other animagi. Even as ponies their genders were still reversed and it felt so weird. But it was amusing to watch the girls turn boys as they tried to walk and sit the way they normally did, and certain things got in the way or were painfully pinched. Even though it was a nice afternoon outside, the Gryffindor first-year cohort huddled in the Gryffindor common room. They resolutely worked on their assignments in an attempt to take their minds off what had happened in potions class. The occasional snickers and broad grins whenever an upper-year student looked at them were bad enough, they didn't dare think how the rest of the school would react. Harry assumed the Slytherins were holed up in their common room doing the same thing for the same reason. Or, holed up in an empty room in the dungeon, considering their head of house's white-hot temper at his or was it her unwanted SEC change. While they knew it really wasn't their fault, most of the first ties couldn't help but scowl at Sweetie Belle and Neville. Harry, Scootaloo, and Apple Bloom tried to be supportive, but both Neville and the poor filly were still depressed over their failed first potions lesson. And its aftermath. The twins, when they showed up after their last class, were delighted at Sweetie's genius, as they called it, for inventing a gender swap potion. They grilled her and Neville carefully for half an hour before begging them for a few hairs and then running back out into the castle. Harry shuddered at what they might produce with that information and hair. He had already heard of their many prank exploits. So it was, that the Gryffindor First High cohort managed to finish all their weekend assignments shortly before their dinner. They tried to beg out of it, but Percy and the other prefects were merciless. A simple potions accident is not reason to skip dinner, was the ruling. As a result, most of dinner was spent with the rest of the school snickering and laughing at the unfortunate first years as they tried and failed to be inconspicuous. The only good point was that the Slytherin students were heckled worse than the Gryffindors. Not surprisingly, Professor Snape did not make an appearance at the head table, to Professor McGonagall's immense amusement. Plus, every time someone mentioned it, there was outright laughter from most of the rest of the school that didn't have the professor as their head of house. After dinner was when the latest difficulty appeared. The stairs turned into a slide just a moment after the first girl transformed into a boy stepped onto them. Dean discovered that a boy transformed into a girl could easily walk up the steps. While it wasn't a pressing issue at the moment, the witches still wanted their cuddle time with the ponies, as Ron said, accompanied by a shudder, "No way am I going to sleep in the girls' dorm tonight." Several of the upper-year girls and boys snickered at this declaration. "You'll be singing a different tune in a few years, my boys, if you have such an opportunity," Harry heard one murmur. Percy, on seeing their problem, said, "I'll go get Professor McGonagall," and started for the Gryffindor door. "Nay. No need to do that," Sweetie Belle said. "Alicia," she said to the chaser, who was laughing at the first year's difficulties, along with the rest of the students still in the common room. "Would you please get my trunk? We can use it to get to Apple Bloom's trunk and skip the stairs completely." While they waited for her to return, she added, "And we can use the 2 trunks' bathrooms to get ready for bed." And forestalled Percy's complaint about how inappropriate it would be for the girls-turned-boys to use the girls' dorm facilities. Because, of course, they were now boys. It took less than 5 minutes to fetch the trunk and determine that that was a workable solution. Later, when the firsties' curfew arrived, Harry shook his head resignedly and trudged up the stairs to his room, the other boys-girls, trailing him. They used his trunk's bathroom to get ready for bed, one at a time. None wanted the others to see himself as a girl in anything less than pajamas, bottoms and tops. Also that evening, in the headmaster's meeting room, the headmaster leaned back in his chair. He was waiting for the professors to come in after dinner for their scheduled first-week analysis of the first years. After 2 years of dealing with the terrible twins, as the staff called them, they had thought they were used to mayhem. This week was already showing them that they had been sorely mistaken. It was shaping up to be an exciting year, in many different ways, Dumbledore mused. Not to mention painful, he thought, deliberately not rubbing the sore spot on his arse where Minerva had hexed him earlier in the day. She was quite good, he had discovered, at hexing him unexpectedly. And she had an uncanny ability to hit the same spots repeatedly. He hadn't expected her to be so vindictive for so long. Perhaps she would settle down after this meeting. "Well," he said, as Professor Sinistra settled into her chair, "it has been an exciting week, hasn't it?" He glanced around the table at his staff, his eyes twinkling. Snape's glare back at him, and the rest of the professors, was nothing short of incendiary. The other professors had great difficulty keeping straight faces. Considering the potion professor's reputation for a temper, none wanted to test it when it was already stretched to the breaking point. Some of you already know this, but for those that don't, we have 17 pureblood starting this year, 8 of the 20 boys are heirs and 8 of the 24 girls are heiresses. There are 3 foreign purebloods, as well, Miss Sweetie Belle, Miss Scootaloo, and Miss Apple Bloom, although only Miss Aloo appears to be an heiress, he summarized. The foreigners are reluctant to name their home country, preferring to say that they are from a small town called Ponyville, instead. But rumors suggest that their home might be Atlantis. That caused a stir in the room as the professors murmured and exchanged speculative or surprised looks, although Minerva was still glaring at him, to Quirinus and Severus' temporary amusement. He could tell Severus was amused because her scowl lessened ever so little whenever she saw McGonagall's expression while looking at Dumbledore. If true, that would explain their reluctance. If it came out that they were from Atlantis, I can't imagine the attention they would get. And the ministry would feel obligated to become involved, I'm sure. He shook his head. It is ruled by 2 or 3 princesses, I'm not sure of the exact number. The 3 girls' attendance at Hogwarts is being sponsored by these princesses. He paused, stroked his beard, and then said, Miss Bell is capable of wandless magic, and has apparently taught Mr. Potter that skill as well. Both are capable of apparition, as is Miss Granger, another of the Gryffindor first years. The professors gasped as one. Surely you are jesting, Headmaster, Professor Snape scoffed. No child that young and new to a wand could mstr that skill. No, he replied. No jest. He shook his head slowly, his eyes twinkling. In point of fact, Miss Twilight Sparkle, one of the adult Atlanteans Minerva and I have met, the one who seems to be their leader here in Britain, had Mr. Potter demonstrate his ability. He did so without using a wand. He had not yet picked up his wand from Ollivanders. Then, as I watched, she created a brand new version of the apparition spell that removes all its distasteful side effects. And made it safer. Mr. Potter operat without a wand, gasped Professor McGonagall, surprise replacing her glare. You say she created a new version? Professor Flitwick asked incredulously. The other professors simply stared in various stages of disbelief. The old wizard nodded. I saw her do so. She said she was adapting their teleportation spell to work with a wand. She then proceeded to teach Miss Granger how to successfully use the spell in less than half an hour. With a borrowed wand. The room was silent. The Ministry is currently evaluating her new version before releasing it to the public. In addition, the Gryffindor first-year cohort has 7 students who are animagi, 3 are the foreigners. I saw them teach Ginny Weasley how to become her Pegasus Animagus, which took less than a morning. He could see both Minerva and Phileas re-evaluating their opinions of the magical potential of those particular students. Mr. Weasley tells me that by the next day they had taught all the Weasley children to become animagi, as well as the entire Gryffindor Quidditch team. He looked over at Professor McGonagall and smiled at her stunned expression. Yes, Minerva, half of your Quidditch team, Mr. Wood, and Mrs. Johnson and Spin-Net, are Pegasi Animagi. Who knows what effect that will have on their playing abilities? We all know that some of an Animagi's animal senses and reactions bleed over to their human side. His smile broadened as her eyes widened in understanding. Albus looked at Severus, who was scowling furiously. Whether that was at hearing the disadvantage her team would face or the fact that Gryffindor had 13 children who were Animagi, while her/his house had none, was impossible to tell. At 13 Animagi, Dumbledore said, they almost triple the number of registered Animagi in Britain in the last century. And the 7 first years make the most registered in any one year, with the 4 third-year students the second most. It is odd, though, that all of them are variations on ponies, he said thoughtfully. I have never heard of such a close grouping of Animagi animals, usually they are quite random. He shook his head mildly. He looked over at his Transfiguration professor, but she was still lost in considering how the Gryffindor Quidditch team might benefit from being Pegasi Animagi. For a moment, he considered telling them that Molly had also mastered that skill. But that had nothing to do with the school, so he would leave that off the table. Still, including Molly meant the Weasley family, by itself, almost doubled the number of Animagi in England from 7 to 13. And all of that was before they arrived at our wonderful school, he added. He glanced around at the listening professors. Why didn't you tell us all this before session started? Asked Minerva, coming back to the conversation and clearly upset at having such important accomplishments kept secret until now. Well, at least she wasn't glaring at him anymore. I didn't want to prejudice your opinions of them before you had a chance to see them in a classroom environment, he explained. I wanted you to judge them solely on their classwork, and what you saw of them in your classes. I feared you might otherwise have unreasonable expectations on their abilities or treat them as more than just new first-year students, or foreigners who are first-year students. Warning you beforehand would have inflated your expectations of their schoolwork, leading you to unfairly judge their skills more harshly than you would have normally. He noticed that Quirinus was nodding his head and paying close attention. To recap the week, Monday morning, the headmaster went on. Miss Scudaloo apparently completely by accident managed to assist Professor Binns to his next great adventure by informing him that he was deceased, and had been for some time. He chuckled as did most of the staff. He cleared his throat. I am still looking for a prospective replacement. Any suggestions you might have for a suitable candidate would be appreciated. He looked around hopefully, then sighed at the multitude of heads shaking. No, Severus merely glared at him. Monday afternoon they threw the entire school into a tizzy as Misters Potter and Ron Weasley, and Mrs. Alou, Bloom, Bell, Granger, and Ginny Weasley displayed their animagus forms. Tuesday, Mr. Potter managed to disrupt most of the school with a display of a charm he called the book manifestation spell, that lets one enter a book for learning. It is a simple, yet powerful tool for learning, as I found in my own explorations with it. I'm sure it will revolutionize teaching. Phileas, he nodded at the diminutive wizard, can answer any questions you might have about it. He is quite impressed with how it has improved the study habits of the Gryffindors, and their attention in class. He is reserving judgment on if it will improve their assignments. Thursday, Mr. Ron Weasley and Miss Bloom apparently were ambushed by the walking plants in greenhouse number 1. As a result, Pomona, he nodded in her direction as she smiled, has the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff first years carrying the plants through the school and casting diagnostic spells on the plants after every class. He smiled back at her, eyes twinkling. She has promised to tell us the results of her impromptu study at our next meeting. I am quite looking forward to it. And then today, Miss Sweetie Belle apparently reversed the gender of everyone in her Gryffindor/Slytherin potions class. Severus, could you tell us about that? With much grumbling and asides as to the uselessness of the Gryffindor dunderheads in general, she explained what had happened. The mirthful looks on her fellow professors' faces when they heard her speak did not make the telling of the tale any pleasanter for her. After finishing, she crossed her arms under her chest and glowered menacingly at everyone, daring them to say anything. It was surprisingly effective, despite her new gender and shape. And Poppy? Any insights? MDM Pomfrey, the school healer, sighed. I don't know how the potion did what it did, but it switched their genders. I've studied the sample provided by Severus, as has he, and we have reached no conclusions on how long this condition will last or if it is permanent. For the moment, I suggest we merely wait it out and hope it wears off in a reasonable amount of time. In the meantime, the students are not unduly upset at the situation and I believe it might be a good learning experience once the potion wears off. An excellent thought. The headmaster nodded sagely. Is there anything else of note about this year's incoming students? Professor McGonagall spoke up. The Gryffindor first years seem remarkably unified this year. They are rarely separated, forming a large study group in the common room. She sighed, and they have discovered that working together makes the research for assignments much easier. They readily share what each learns, coaching any who seem to not understand. Their assignments are much more detailed than most first years, and also more uniform. There are only so many ways you can describe the skills used to turn a match into a needle. Fortunately, I haven't yet seen anyone trying to copy another's work. She frowned. Percy Weasley tells me they even stick together when exploring the grounds outside. He has also told me that the 3 foreign girls have shown an interest in the Forbidden Forest. They seem to regard the dangers in it as not very impressive after he had warned them. They told him that they had run into cockatrices, timber wolves, hydras, and chimeras in the woods by their hometown. Miss Alou was even heard to say something about cutie mark crusaders' giant spider wranglers to her friends. The professors were astonished at such claims. Nonsense, burst out the potions professor. Fantasies. There is no way that those dunderheads could have seen any of those creatures and survived. Very few adult wizards could have managed that. She scowled heavily. Ignoring Professor Snape, Minerva continued. Miss Bell said that Miss Sparkle had run into a cockatrice and been turned to stone, only to be rescued by another witch, Miss Fluttershy, who used a power Miss Bell called the Stare to get the cockatrice to release her. Not a spell or potion, notice. Miss Bell was quite clear that this was an ability that only Miss Shy seems to have. There were more than a few raised eyebrows at that. She claimed that animals were Miss Shy's special talent. Bah! A figment of her imagination. Severus once more interjected, still scowling. Being of the opposite SEC had done nothing to curb her skepticism, or her sharp tongue. Minerva just stared at her. Nonetheless, she provided enough details on her various adventures to convince Percy Weasley she was telling the truth, as difficult as it may seem, she said flatly. He asked her about tatzelworms and ursa majors and minors that they had also mentioned encountering, creatures he didn't know. Apparently, a tatzelworm and an ursa minor have attacked their town over the past year and been driven off or taken away by Miss Sparkle. The tatzelworm is a Class 4X creature whose home is in the Alps, you may or may not know. Miss Bell described the ursa minor as a baby stellar bear, a bear whose hide looks like the night sky. The ursa minor was as big as a house, it would seem. Ha! Fictions they created to impress their gullible classmates, I'd say, Professor Snape said as she again disparaged the stories. Dumbledore stared at the scowling professor. Severus, you would have said the same about the 7 Gryffindor first year's animagus ability which most of us here have seen them do on the grounds and the abilities of Mr. Potter, Miss Bell, and Miss Granger to apparate, which I have witnessed myself. Please keep an open mind. Scowling even more darkly, the professor nodded and looked away. The headmaster looked back at the rest of the professors. We can easily verify the stories by sending an owl to Miss Sparkle, the headmaster suggested. We should have an answer soon enough as to how vivid an imagination these children have. He would send the owl tonight. Dumbledore studied his staff. His professor of transfigurations had an expression that he knew usually meant she had something to bring up about her students that she found discomfiting. Minerva cleared her throat and looked somewhat embarrassed. Percy also told me that the girls wanted to know the name of the Cerberus on the 3rd floor. She sighed. And if he liked tummy rubs. There was a moment of stunned silence. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 20. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.